Well, thank you all very much. I want to begin by thanking Dean Skip Rutherford and the Clinton School for Public Service for allowing me to speak. I'll be honest, it's a real honor for me to speak in my own hometown about my recent work on the campaign trail. First, I want to make sure that everybody understands what the Associated Press is. We are the largest news gathering operation in the world. We are bigger than CNN. We are bigger than the New York Times. We are bigger than USA Today. We supply pictures, stories, graphics, video, and audio to most news organizations around the world and most news websites like Yahoo and AOL. AP photos are seen around the globe, sometimes within minutes of the photographer taking them. And I'm immensely proud to work for such an organization that is committed to covering the most important story of the day, photographically. And on the trail, the AP had a photographer traveling with the campaign, with the senator's campaign, since Iowa. Many times we were the only still photographer traveling with the campaign, and as you can imagine, it was at great expense. People ask me how I got assigned to cover Senator Obama, and I'll be honest, I really am not 100% sure. As I tell people, it's kind of above my pay grade. But I'm thrilled that I got a front row to history. The AP has about 100 staff photographers in North America. And for me to be selected to cover this was a real honor, for which I'm very grateful to the company. I should also say it's no bed of roses by any stretch. The days are very long, sometimes 20 hours. The quarters very tight, and the competition, some of the very best in the world. And throw in the occasional family crisis. And hurricane. I live in New Orleans, and this year we had a couple of hurricanes that we were pretty worried about. And that makes for a very high-pressure situation. What I'd like to do is, if the screen will cooperate, and I hope that it will, I'd like to show a slideshow. And after the slideshow, I've got some images that I can talk about, and I'd like to take as many questions as y'all want to listen to me answer. I don't have anything else to do tonight. If you see a particular image in this slideshow that you like, please please make a note of it, and I can call it back up afterwards, or I can try to help remember which one it is and show you that, and we can talk about that specific image if you want. This slideshow is images that I took pretty much in the order of the date that I took them, set to the senator's very famous speech on race in Philadelphia in March of this year. He's supposed to have audio with it, I swear. There you go.
Senator Barack Obama.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Let me begin by thanking Harris Wofford for his contributions to this country in so many different ways. He exemplifies what we mean by the word citizen. And so we are very grateful to him for all the work he has done, and I'm thankful for the gracious, thoughtful introduction. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. 221 years ago, in a hall that still stands across the street, a group of men gathered and with these simple words launched America's improbable experiment in democracy. Farmers and scholars, statesmen and patriots who had traveled across the ocean to escape tyranny and persecution finally made real their Declaration of Independence at a Philadelphia convention that lasted through the spring of 1787. The document they produced was eventually signed, but ultimately unfinished. It was stained by this nation's original sin of slavery. A question that divided the colonies and brought the convention to a stalemate until the founders chose to allow the slave trade to continue for at least 20 more years and to leave any final resolution to future generations. Of course, the answer to the slavery question was already embedded within our Constitution. A Constitution that had at its very core the ideal of equal citizenship under the law. A Constitution that promised its people liberty and justice, and a union that could be and should be perfected over time. And yet words on a parchment would not be enough to deliver slaves from bondage, to provide men and women of every color and creed their full rights and obligations as citizens of the United States. What would be needed were Americans in successive generations who were willing to do their part through protests and struggles on the streets and in the courts, through a civil war and civil disobedience, and always at great risk, to narrow that gap between the promise of our ideals and the reality of their time. This was one of the tasks we set forth at the beginning of this presidential campaign, to continue the long march of those who came before us, a march for a more just, more equal, more free, more caring, more prosperous America. I chose to run for president at this moment in history because I believe deeply that we cannot solve the challenges of our time unless we solve them together, unless we perfect our union by understanding that we may have different stories, but we hold common hopes. That we may not look the same and may not have come from the same place, but we all want to move in the same direction towards a better future for our children and our grandchildren. This belief comes from my unyielding faith in the decency and generosity of the American people. But it also comes from my own story. I'm the son of a black man from Kenya and a white woman from Kansas. I was raised with the help of a white grandfather who survived the Depression to serve in Patton's Army during World War II, and a white grandmother who worked on a bomber assembly line at Fort Leavenworth while he was overseas. I've gone to some of the best schools in America, and I've lived in one of the world's poorest nations. I am married to a black American who carries within her the blood of slaves and slave owners, an inheritance we pass on to our two precious daughters. I have brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, uncles, and cousins of every race and every hue, scattered across 3 continents, and for as long as I live, I will never forget that in no other country on earth is my story even possible. It's a story that hasn't made me the most conventional of candidates, but it is a story that has seared into my genetic makeup the idea that this nation is more than the sum of its parts, that out of many, we are truly one. Now, throughout the first year of this campaign, against all predictions to the contrary, we saw how hungry the American people were for this message of unity. Despite the temptation to view my candidacy through a purely racial lens, we won commanding victories in states with some of the whitest populations in the country. In South Carolina, where the Confederate flag still flies, we built a powerful coalition of African Americans and white Americans. This is not to say that race has not been an issue in this campaign. At various stages in the campaign, some commentators have deemed me either too black or not black enough. We saw racial tensions bubble to the surface during the week before the South Carolina primary. The press has scoured every single exit poll for the latest evidence of racial polarization, not just in terms of white and black, but black and brown as well. And yet, it's only been in the last couple of weeks that the discussion of race in this campaign has taken a particularly divisive turn. On one end of the spectrum, we've heard the implication that my candidacy is somehow an exercise in affirmative action that is based solely on the desire of wild and wide-eyed liberals to purchase racial reconciliation on the cheap. On the other end, we've heard my former pastor, Jeremiah Wright, use incendiary language to express views that have the potential not only to widen the racial divide, but views that denigrate both the greatness and the goodness of our nation, and that rightly offend white and black alike. I have already condemned, in unequivocal terms, the statements of Reverend Wright that have caused such controversy and in some cases pain. For some, nagging questions remain. Did I know him to be an occasionally fierce critic of American domestic and foreign policy? Of course. Did I ever hear him make remarks that could be considered controversial while I sat in the church? Yes. Did I strongly disagree with many of his political views? Absolutely. Just as I'm sure many of you have heard remarks from your pastors, priests, or rabbis with which you strongly disagree. But the remarks that have caused this recent firestorm weren't simply controversial. They weren't simply a religious leader's efforts to speak out against perceived injustice. Instead, they expressed a profoundly distorted view of this country, a view that sees white racism as endemic, and that elevates what is wrong with America above all that we know is right with America. A view that sees the conflicts in the Middle East as rooted primarily in the actions of stalwart allies like Israel, instead of emanating from the perverse and hateful ideologies of radical Islam. As such, Reverend Wright's comments were not only wrong, but divisive. Divisive at a time when we need unity, racially charged at a time when we need to come together to solve a set of monumental problems. 2 wars, a terrorist threat, a falling economy, a chronic healthcare crisis, and potentially devastating climate change. Problems that are neither black or white or Latino or Asian, but rather problems that confront us all. Given my background, my politics, and my professed values and ideas, there will no doubt be those for whom my statements of condemnation are not enough. Why associate myself with Reverend Wright in the first place, they may ask? Why not join another church? And I confess that if all that I knew of Reverend Wright were the snippets of those sermons that have run in an endless loop on the television sets and YouTube, if Trinity United Church of Christ conformed to the caricatures being peddled by some commentators, there is no doubt that I would react in much the same way. But the truth is, that isn't all that I know of the man. The man I met more than 20 years ago is a man who helped introduce me to my Christian faith. A man who spoke to me about our obligations to love one another, to care for the sick, and lift up the poor. He is a man who served his country as a United States Marine, and who has studied and lectured at some of the finest universities and seminaries in the country, and who over 30 years has led a church that serves the community by doing God's work here on earth, by housing the homeless, ministering to the needy, providing daycare services, scholarships, and prison ministries, and reaching out to those suffering from HIV/AIDS. In my first book, Dreams from My Father, I describe the experience of my first service at Trinity, and it goes as follows. People began to shout, to rise from their seats and clap and cry out. A forceful wind carrying the Reverend's voice up to the rafters. And in that single note, hope, I heard something else. At the foot of that cross, inside the thousands of churches across the city, I imagine the stories of ordinary black people merging with the stories of David and Goliath, Moses and Pharaoh, the Christians in the lion's den, Ezekiel's field of dry bones. Those stories of survival and freedom and hope became our stories, my story. The blood that spilled was our blood, the tears our tears, until this black church, on this bright day, seemed once more a vessel carrying the story of a people into future generations and into a larger world. Our trials and triumphs became at once unique and universal, black and more than black. In chronicling our journey, the stories and songs gave us a meaning to reclaim memories that we didn't need to feel shame about. Memories that all people might study and cherish, and with which we could start to rebuild. That has been my experience at Trinity.
We're just going to pause and see if we can make that work again. It gets hot, overheating. And we're back.
We could start to rebuild. That has been my experience at Trinity. Like other predominantly black churches across the country, Trinity embodies the black community in its entirety, the doctrine and the welfare model, the model student and the former gangbanger. Like other black churches, Trinity's services are full of raucous laughter and sometimes bawdy humor. They are full of dancing and clapping and screaming and shouting that may seem jarring to the untrained ear. The church contains in full the kindness and cruelty, the fierce intelligence and the shocking ignorance, the struggles and successes, the love, and yes, the bitterness and biases that make up the black experience in America. And this helps explain, perhaps, my relationship with Reverend Riker. As imperfect as he may be, he has been like family to me. He strengthened my faith, officiated my wedding, and baptized my children. Not once in my conversations with him have I heard him talk about any ethnic group in derogatory terms, or treat whites with whom he interacted with anything but courtesy and respect. He contains within him the contradictions, the good and the bad, of the community that he has served diligently for so many years. I can no more disown him than I can disown the black community. I can no more disown him than I can disown my white grandmother, a woman who helped raise me, a woman who sacrificed again and again for me, a woman who loves me as much as she loves anything in this world, but a woman who once confessed her fear of black men who passed her by on the street, and who on more than one occasion has uttered racial or ethnic stereotypes that made me cringe. These people are part of me, and they are part of America, this country that I love. Now, some will see this as an attempt to justify or excuse comments that are simply inexcusable. I can assure you it is not. And I suppose the politically safe thing to do would be to move on from this episode and just hope that it fades into the woodwork. We can dismiss Reverend Wright as a crank or a demagogue, just as some have dismissed Geraldine Ferraro in the aftermath of her recent statements as harboring some deep-seated bias. But race is an issue that I believe this nation cannot afford to ignore right now. We would be making the same mistake that Reverend Wright made in his offending sermons about America, to simplify and stereotype and amplify the negative to the point that it distorts reality. The fact is that the comments that have been made and the issues that have surfaced over the last few weeks reflect the complexities of race in this country that we've never really worked through, a part of our union that we have not yet made perfect. And if we walk away now, if we simply retreat into our respective corners, we will never be able to come together and solve challenges like healthcare or education or the need to find good jobs for every American. Understanding this reality requires a reminder of how we arrived at this point. As William Faulkner once wrote, the past isn't dead and buried. In fact, it isn't even past. We do not need to recite here the history of racial injustice in this country. But we do need to remind ourselves that so many of the disparities that exist between the African American community and the larger American community today can be traced directly to inequalities passed on from an earlier generation that suffered under the brutal legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. Segregated schools were and are inferior schools. We still haven't fixed them 50 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And the inferior education they provided, then and now, helps explain the pervasive achievement gap between today's black and white students. Legalized discrimination, where blacks were prevented, often through violence, from owning property, where loans were not granted to African American business owners, where black homeowners could not access FHA mortgages, or blacks were excluded from unions, or the police force, or the fire department, meant that black families could not amass any meaningful wealth to bequeath to future generations. That history helps explain the wealth and income gap between blacks and whites and the concentrated pockets of poverty that persist in so many of today's urban and rural communities. A lack of economic opportunity among black men, and the shame and frustration that came from not being able to provide for one's family contributed to the erosion of black families, a problem that welfare policies for many years may have worsened, and the lack of basic services in so many urban black neighborhoods, parks for kids to play in, police walking the beat, regular garbage pickup, building code enforcement, all help create a cycle of violence, blight, and neglect that continues to haunt us. This is the reality in which Reverend Wright and other African Americans of his generation grew up. They came of age in the late 50s and early 60s, a time when segregation was still the law of the land and opportunity was systematically constricted. What's remarkable is not how many failed in the face of discrimination, but how many men and women overcame the odds, how many were able to make a way out of nowhere for those like me who would come after them. But for all those who scratched and clawed their way to get a piece of the American dream, there were many who didn't make it. Those who were ultimately defeated in one way or another by discrimination. that legacy of defeat was passed on to future generations. Those young men, increasingly young women who we see standing on street corners or languishing in our prisons without hope or prospects for the future. Even for those blacks who did make it, questions of race and racism continue to define their worldview in fundamental ways. For the men and women of Reverend Wright's generation, the memories of humiliation and doubt and fear have not gone away, nor is the anger and the bitterness of those years. That anger may not get expressed in public, in front of white co-workers or white friends, but it does find voice in the barber shop or the beauty shop, around the kitchen table. At times, that anger is exploited by politicians to gin up votes along racial lines or to make up for a politician's own failings. And occasionally, it finds voice in the church on Sunday morning, in the pulpit and in the pews. The fact that so many people are surprised to hear that anger in some of Reverend Wright's sermons simply reminds us of the old truism that the most segregated hour of American life occurs on Sunday morning. That anger is not always productive. Indeed, all too often it distracts attention from solving real problems. It keeps us from squarely facing our own complicity within the African American community, in our own condition. It prevents the African American community from forging the alliances it needs to bring about real change. But the anger is real. It is powerful. And to simply wish it away, to condemn it without understanding its roots, only serves to widen the chasm of misunderstanding that exists between the races. In fact, a similar anger exists within segments of the white community. Most working and middle-class white Americans don't feel that they have been particularly privileged by their race. Their experience is the immigrant experience. As far as they're concerned, no one handed them anything. They built it from scratch. They've worked hard all their lives, many times only to see their jobs shipped overseas or their pensions dumped after a lifetime of labor. They are anxious about their futures, and they feel their dreams slipping away, and in an era of stagnant wages and global competition, opportunity comes to be seen as a zero-sum game in which your dreams come at my expense. So when they are told to bus their children to a school across town, when they hear an African American is getting an advantage in landing a good job or a spot in a good college because of an injustice that they themselves never committed, when they're told that their fears about crime in urban neighborhoods are somehow prejudice, resentment builds over time. Like the anger within the black community, these resentments aren't always expressed in polite company, but they have helped shape the political landscape for at least a generation. Anger over welfare and affirmative action helped forge the Reagan coalition. Politicians routinely exploited fears of crime for their own electoral ends. Talk show hosts and conservative commentators built entire careers unmasking bogus claims of racism while dismissing legitimate discussions of racial injustice and inequality as mere political correctness or reverse racism. And just as black anger often proves counterproductive, so have these white resentments distracted attention from the real culprits of the middle-class squeeze. A corporate culture rife with inside dealing, questionable accounting practices, and short-term greed. A Washington dominated by lobbyists and special interests. Economic policies that favor the few over the many. And yet to wish away the resentments of white Americans, to label them as misguided or even racist, without recognizing they are grounded in legitimate concerns, this too widens the racial divide and blocks the path to understanding. This is where we are right now. It's a racial stalemate we've been stuck in for years. Contrary to the claims of some of my critics, black and white, I have never been so naive as to believe that we can get beyond our racial divisions in a single election cycle or with a single candidate, particularly a candidacy as imperfect as my own. But I have asserted a firm conviction, a conviction rooted in my faith in God and my faith in the American people, that working together we can move beyond some of our old racial wounds, and that in fact we have no choice. We have no choice if we are to continue on the path of a more perfect union. For the African American community, that path means embracing the burdens of our past without becoming victims of our past. It means continuing to insist on a full measure of justice in every aspect of American life. But it also means binding our particular grievances for better health care and better schools and better jobs to the larger aspirations of all Americans. The white woman struggling to break the glass ceiling, the white man who's been laid off, the immigrant trying to feed his family. And it means also taking full responsibility for our own lives by demanding more from our fathers and spending more time with our children and reading to them and teaching them that while they may face challenges and discrimination in their own lives, they must never succumb to despair or cynicism. They must always believe that they can write their own destiny. Ironically, this quintessentially American and, yes, conservative notion of self-help found frequent expression in Reverend Wright's sermons. But what my former pastor too often failed to understand is that embarking on a program of self-help also requires a belief that society can change. The profound mistake of Reverend Wright's sermons is not that he spoke about racism in our society. It's that he spoke as if our society was static, as if no progress had been made, as if this country, a country that has made it possible for one of his own members to run for the highest office in the land and build a coalition of white and black, Latino, Asian, rich, poor, young, and old, is still irrevocably bound to a tragic past. What we know, what we have seen, is that America can change. That is the true genius of this nation. What we have already achieved gives us hope, the audacity to hope for what we can and must achieve tomorrow. Now, in the white community, the path to a more perfect union means acknowledging that what ails the African American community does not just exist in the minds of black people, that the legacy of discrimination and current incidents of discrimination, while less overt than in the past, that these things are real and must be addressed, not just with words, but with deeds, by investing in our schools, in our communities, by enforcing our civil rights laws and ensuring fairness in our criminal justice system, by providing this generation with ladders of opportunity that were unavailable for previous generations. It requires all Americans to realize that your dreams do not have to come at the expense of my dreams, that investing in the health, welfare, and education of black and brown and white children will ultimately help all of America prosper. In the end, then, what is called for is nothing more and nothing less than what all the world's great religions demand. that we do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Let us be our brother's keeper, Scripture tells us. Let us be our sister's keeper. Let us find that common stake we all have in one another, and let our politics reflect that spirit as well. For we have a choice in this country. We can accept a politics that breeds division and conflict and cynicism. We can tackle race only as spectacle, as we did in the O.J. trial, or in the wake of tragedy, as we did in the aftermath of Katrina, or as fodder for the nightly news. We can play Reverend Wright's sermons on every channel, every day, and talk about them from now until the election, and make the only question in this campaign whether or not the American people think that I somehow believe or sympathize with his most offensive words. We can pounce on some gaffe by a Hillary supporter as evidence that she's playing the race card. Or we can speculate on whether white men will all flock to John McCain in the general election, regardless of his policies. We can do that. But if we do, I can tell you that in the next election, we'll be talking about some other distraction. And then another one. And then another one. And nothing will change. That is one option. Or, at this moment, in this election, we can come together and say, not this time. This time we want to talk about the crumbling schools that are stealing the future of black children and white children and Asian children and Hispanic children and Native American children. This time we want to reject the cynicism that tells us that these kids can't learn, that those kids who don't look like us are somebody else's problem. The children of America are not those kids, they are our kids, and we will not let them fall behind in the 21st century economy. Not this time. This time we want to talk about how the lines in the emergency room are filled with whites and blacks and Hispanics who do not have health care, who don't have the power on their own to overcome the special interests in Washington, but who can take them on if we do it together. This time, we want to talk about the shuttered mills that once provided a decent life for men and women of every race, and the homes for sale that once belonged to Americans from every religion, every region, every walk of life. This time, we want to talk about the fact that the real problem is not that someone who doesn't look like you might take your job, it's that the corporation you work for will ship it overseas for nothing more than a profit. This time, we want to talk about the men and women of every color and creed who serve together and fight together and bleed together under the same proud flag. We want to talk about how to bring them home from a war that should have never been authorized and should have never been waged. And we want to talk about how we'll show our patriotism by caring for them and their families and giving them the benefits that they have earned. I would not be running for president if I didn't believe with all my heart that this is what the vast majority of Americans want for this country. This union may never be perfect, but generation after generation has shown that it can always be perfected. And today, whenever I find myself feeling doubtful or cynical about this possibility, what gives me the most hope is the next generation. The young people whose attitudes and beliefs and openness to change have already made history in this election. There's one story in particular that I'd like to leave you with today. A story I told when I had the great honor of speaking on Dr. King's birthday at home church, Ebenezer Baptist in Atlanta. There's a young 23-year-old woman, a white woman, named Ashley Byatt, who organized for our campaign in Florence, South Carolina. She'd been working to organize a mostly African-American community since the beginning of this campaign. And one day she was at a roundtable discussion where everyone went around telling their story and why they were there. And Ashley said that when she was 9 years old, her mother got cancer. And because she had to miss days of work, she was let go and lost her health care. They had to file for bankruptcy. And that's when Ashley decided that she had to do something to help her mom. She knew that food was one of their most expensive costs. And so Ashley convinced her mother that what she really liked and really wanted to eat more than anything else was mustard and relish sandwiches. Because that was the cheapest way to eat. It's the mind of a 9-year-old. She did this for a year until her mom got better. Until Ashley told everyone at the round table that the reason she had joined our campaign was so that she could help the millions of other children in the country who want and need to help their parents too. Now, Ashley might have made a different choice. Perhaps somebody told her along the way that the source of her mother's problems were blacks who were on welfare and too lazy to work, or Hispanics who were coming into the country illegally. But she didn't. She sought out allies in the fight against injustice. Anyway, Ashley finishes her story and then goes around the room and asks everyone else why they're supporting the campaign. They all have different stories, different reasons. Many bring up a specific issue. And finally, they come to this elderly black man who's been sitting there quietly the entire time. And Ashley asks him why he's there. And he doesn't bring up a specific issue. He does not say healthcare or the economy. He does not say education or the war. He does not say that he was there because of Barack Obama. He simply says to everyone in the room, I am here because of Ashley. I'm here because of Ashley. Now by itself, that single moment of recognition between that young white girl and that old black man is not enough. It is not enough to give health care to the sick, or jobs to the jobless, or education to our children. But it is where we start. It is where our union grows stronger. And as so many generations have come to realize over the course of the 221 years since a band of patriots signed that document right here in Philadelphia, that is where perfection begins. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Now comes the part where y'all get to ask questions, and I can show you some of the pictures that you just looked at more closely. So I really do, if you have a question specifically, looks like we've got one microphone there and one microphone there. Wow.
Two mics there. If you'd raise your hand, it's like pretty bad in here, so just raise your hand on your
I
side.
feel like this is a town hall meeting. I've covered a bunch of those. What I have here are just some specific images that I want to talk about. My campaign season began when I left home the day after Christmas for New Hampshire to cover the primary in that state. I was gone from home for 171 days this year. I left New Hampshire with former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee and traveled with his campaign for about 3 weeks. I left that campaign to go down to do that little thing we have every year in New Orleans called Mardi Gras. And the day after Mardi Gras, Senator Obama spoke at a rally at Tulane University in New Orleans. I shot this picture here, there. What it is it's fairly simple. It's a silhouette of the back of his head from one of those high-powered TV lights that they put up at the campaign events. At most events, the AP has a photographer that travels with the campaign, and then they have another photographer that will go to the back riser and shoot that center position just like that TV guy is shooting that from the back, just a head-on shot. That was my job that day. I wasn't traveling with the campaign yet. And so I shot that center position, and then I lived in New Orleans, so I knew a lot of the people at the university, and so I kind of moved around the room. I went up top and I made one circle, and I went down below and I made another circle, and I shot this picture. I filed about 10 images that day, and I, didn't really think much more about it until a couple weeks later, I'm cleaning the gutters on my house, and my cell phone rings, just where you want to be when you're on the ladder. So I take the glove off, I answer the phone, and it's a photo editor from New York from Time magazine. She says, "Oh, I need to ask you a couple of questions about this picture." And I answer her questions. I say, "Oh, are you going to use the picture?" And she said, "Yeah, it's the cover." Needless to say, I still had to finish the gutters. But I was really thrilled, and my office was really thrilled. Time has thousands of images they can choose from, including their own photographer, Callie Schell, who was with the campaign for quite a bit. So they selected this, and that might have had something to do with me going out about 2 weeks later on the campaign trail. I don't know that, but it could. I really had no idea what I was in for when I got there. This is what every morning looks like. Every day, the Secret Service, you get to the airplane, and the Secret Service has to check you. They sweep you, they check every item of luggage and carry-on bag with the explosives dog to make sure there's nothing in it that shouldn't be there. And it can be rather chaotic. That picture was shot at 7 a.m., which means that everybody there probably got up around 4:30 or 5 a.m., and there's no telling what time we got to bed. And this was every day. And you can see they've got, the luggage is spread out, and the reason why it's got a little space between it is so that the dog can sniff it as they leave the dog through it. This is a fairly early day. However, the other group, the protective pool, and let me explain what that is. You have the huge group that is the traveling press with him, and then you have a smaller group called the protective pool. Our job in the protective pool is to travel absolutely everywhere he goes. If he goes to the restaurant, we watch him go in and watch him come out. We don't get to go in and eat. We sit in the van and look for the nearest Starbucks that we can go sit in. And so if you're in the protective pool in the morning, you get up even earlier than this group gets up, and you go and you get swept by the Secret Service, and your luggage gets swept by the bomb dog, and you go sit in the van and wait for him to leave, and you travel in the motorcade, just in case something happens, to the airport. Well, he pulls up in his Secret Service vehicle right in front of the stairs. The motorcade has got Secret Service vehicles, police vehicles, staff vehicles. The press is the last bus. So I'm in the short bus one day, which is what we called it. And I'm in the short bus waiting, and we get to the airport, and I get out of the bus, and I'm the first one out the door. because we have to he don't wait for us. We've got to get underneath the wing of the plane to take those pictures that you see every day of them going in and out of the plane. And so I start running because by then the motorcade was huge, and it's 100 yards to the wing of the plane. And so I'm running the 100 yards. I'm running along, and for some reason, my body was out ahead of my feet. And I went splat on the tarmac with all my camera gear, my 300mm lens, my backpack, all this stuff bouncing along the tarmac. A few of my colleagues got close to me and said, "You okay?" And I'm picking myself up, yeah, I'm fine. And as I look over, my emergency can of Red Bull is rolling down the tarmac. And I yelled to somebody, grab the Red Bull, and kept running. I got there underneath the wing of the plane, and my colleague gave me my Red Bull, which I stuffed in my pocket, and I was able to make a picture of him getting on the plane. But the falling part wasn't every day, but everything else was. Every day we took his picture going on and off the plane, and always we try to do something different. Something like this, I actually have to negotiate with the staff members to get in this position. I say, hey, I want to shoot a picture of him from the top of the steps. And they say yay or nay based on his mood, the weather, any number of things, the background, what's going on that day, what we need to show. We travel with the senator everywhere he goes. And if that means that he goes to Washington, in this case to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a hearing, we go with him. As you can see, there are a bunch of photographers behind him in a little cubbyhole that we work out of. I am one of a gazillion photographers right in front of him. However, I'm guessing really that I'm the only guy that he's recognized because he's seen me on the trail for so long. And so he strolls up to his seat. All the other committee members are seated. It's fairly quiet except for the sounds of shutters as he walks in. And he walks right up to me and goes, whereupon I start laughing. And after I got the picture, of course. These kinds of what I call real moments are not as frequent as we would like. But I always thought it was a fairly real moment. This is Marty Nesbitt, one of the senator's closest friends. This is as he is listening to his friend give the speech on race in Philadelphia. That was a very incredibly historic day. And let me explain a little bit about what they do with this. They usually have this little area called the buffer, and they have us in that area. It's a kind of area between the candidate and the crowd. They had a very tight area that day in that auditorium in Philadelphia. And I turned around as the speech was ending and saw this huge tear coming down his face and made that picture. This is a photo of Senator Obama checking his BlackBerry backstage. He's being introduced, or waiting to be introduced, as I remember. And getting backstage, getting this kind of access is very difficult. You have to ask for it, and then they have to approve it, and then they have to decide, and there's usually lots of things that have to collide at the same time. That day on the campaign trail, Annie Leibovitz, legendary photographer, had come on to shoot some pictures from Men's Vogue. Annie was so nice. We're talking in the bus. She's great. She's got every reason in the world to have a huge ego, and from what I could tell, did not. Very nice. And we got to talk, and I knew that she was going to be backstage. I didn't think anything more of it until I got in that buffer area and I saw this flag, and I thought, and I said, the staff person next to me said, "Chance, I can go backstage." At the same time, Annie Leibovitz is standing backstage saying to the staff person, "You need to get Alex back here. This is a really nice picture," which is very, very gracious of her. And so those two elements collided. They escorted me backstage, and Annie and I actually made an image like, she made one very similar to this that ran Men's Vogue. And then we ran something like that as well, as he walks out into the crowd to speak. The senator took a vacation to Hawaii. It was not a vacation for me. I worked 120 hours in 7 days. Thank God I'm paid hourly. What he is doing here is, this is one of the rocky coasts of Hawaii, and he's got a lei, and he's throwing the flowers from the lei in the water at the spot where he scattered his mother's ashes when she died. And it was really a pretty moment and very significant, and I thought it was very nice. And then this. We found out later that about a week earlier, someone along this edge rocky coast, not necessarily in that spot, had been killed when the wave plucked them from the rocks. That was not something the campaign would like to have happen. Later in that same day, he goes body surfing. This picture is a little fuzzy. That's because I shot it through the glass of this pool bus, because the campaign was very concerned about showing him with his shirt off. They're worried about a Dukakis in the tank moment, or a similar moment where John Kerry is windsurfing. You know, one of those game-changing pictures. And so while members of other members in the pool bus with me said, look, this is a very dangerous thing, we need to have a look at it, they're negotiating with the campaign, and I'm shooting. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. As a photographer, I have to write the caption that is transmitted with the picture. However, people like the Arkansas Democrat, people like New York Times, like Yahoo, frequently edit those captions and make them fit the day, if you will. Not always exactly what I do word for word. Thankfully, there is someone in Washington that fixes my captions, because I'm a photographer and not a writer and can't spell very well. We get to this event, and we get there a little late, and the sky is a little dark, and we've been getting reports that it might rain. And I'm prepared. Not everybody travels with rain gear, but I tried to travel with rain gear thinking that this could happen. And sure enough, it started to rain. He was offered a jacket, which he refused. And the people stood in the rain and listened to him speak. To make this picture, I went behind the stage and was literally surrounded by other photographers wanting that center spot so it lined up just perfectly. And we waited, because at the end of the speech, he always turns around and acknowledges the crowd that's behind him. And we knew that. And so we waited for that to happen. And I used a slow shutter speed, slower, to make so that you could see the rain a little better. The day before the election, he had gotten word that his grandmother had passed away. We'd gotten word very early in the day, and this event is in the evening, and you can see it just framed there. And many of the photographers were absolutely enamored with this reflection, and I shot several of them. This in a different angle that had more water, and it made for some beautiful images. And then he deviated from his stump speech, which is the speech that he regularly gives at most events, and he started to talk about his grandmother. And he started to get emotional. It was amazing to watch him stand in front of a group of people and talk about the woman that raised him and hold most of his emotions in check. Other photographers were so caught up in the reflection that they didn't see these until it got much later. Because he talked for quite a while and had several long tears come down his face. You didn't see many of these pictures. And the reason why you didn't see these pictures published in a lot of newspapers, it was the day before the election. Newspapers try to be fair. They try to match that with a similar picture of McCain. And there's no way you can match a picture of the candidate crying about the death of his grandmother with another picture. So these pictures, as poignant as they are and as significant as they are, you don't really see them. You didn't see them much. They were online, of course, at Yahoo and other websites like that. On election night, it was my job to be in what we call the scissor lift. It's this great big platform that raises up in the air. The AP had about 8 photographers covering his speech in Chicago. In this picture, he's already come out and spoke, and the crowd has waved, and he's walking back in to start the real work. And I was very honored to be a part of the AP team that covered his race for presidency. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, wait. Oh, good.
I've already asked one.
Okay.
A great deal of attention has been paid to the idea that the mainstream media was biased in favor of Barack Obama. And to those from the Democrat Gazette here, I think that the sense of that newspaper is that they would agree with that. As a part of a larger media, would you agree or disagree that there has been a bias in favor of Barack Obama?
It's really funny you should ask that, because on the drive up, I was listening to a radio program where legendary NBC anchorman Tom Brokaw was asked a very similar question. And he said that he had been hearing those exact words since the Goldwater Convention in '64. A couple people in here might remember that. I was alive, but I don't remember it. I worked real hard in my photography not to be biased. I worked really, really hard. If he was in a bad situation, I showed him in a bad situation. If he was in a good situation, I showed him in a good situation. I did, however, try to be respectful. I tried to show him the common courtesy I would show you if I was taking your picture. In other words, if he was picking his nose, I didn't shoot that, because I don't think that's right. And I would hope that someone would do me that favor from taking my picture here tonight. And that's what I tried to do. I personally did not see that, but I will tell you that what we call that thing, that pool, that plane in the wind, we call it the bubble. And we call it the bubble because you oftentimes don't really know what's going on outside the bubble. You're in the bubble. And it's very difficult to get a sense of what other people outside are thinking about the campaign. You know, you see crowds that are thrilled to see this candidate. You don't see other crowds that aren't thrilled with this candidate. So, I mean, I will tell you that colleagues of mine that covered McCain were jeered and booed as they entered the arena to cover him. I didn't have that happen. Anybody else?
Any other questions?
Were there special rules about covering the Obama family, the children?
At first there were. He was trying to be very sensitive about taking pictures of his children, and they weren't out there doing many things. And then they ended up on Entertainment Tonight, I think, or one of the news magazine type shows. And after that, I mean, I was discreet, but I mean, if they're on stage at an event, you know, they're definitely, you know, take their picture, do that kind of thing. But I mean, he spoke about the children on that magazine show. I can't remember which one it was. And he said He said, I watched it and I cringed because I felt uncomfortable about my children doing that. And I think that kind of changed how he dealt with the children issue.
Any other questions?
Well, I have two, and it's not fair, so you. One is, do you have a favorite picture, or just pick one that you like, and explain to us why you like, what you like about it? And then the other question, kind of related, is given how difficult the campaign was for the photographers, would you do it again?
I would absolutely do it again for the history. I mean, it is really, really difficult on family. I will tell you this, if you are married or have a girlfriend or thinking about either one of those things, it is really difficult. I mean, it's a straight up relationship breaker. It really is. It's almost designed to do that. But my favorite picture is probably one of these rain pictures, which should come up on that screen in a second. I felt like those were just beautiful images. The real moment in the campaign, I think that this is also one of my favorites. And I like that because it's a very poignant picture. It shows him, barefoot in a pair of in a swim trunks, and doing a very private moment that I just happen to be able to see and document. And I think that's just funny. It makes me chuckle just about every time I see it. And the funny part is that after I shot that picture and started laughing, because it really was right at me, and other photographers literally, here, right next to me, don't have it because his hands block his face. The photographers behind him, someone hollered "Senator," and he turned around to look at them, and I'm laughing. I mean, I just got chuckled by the whole thing. I really did. Anybody else? Oh, that's here's your darling.
I may have missed it in the news, but did he go back to Hawaii for his grandmother's funeral?
He has not. Not to my knowledge, he has not been back. I've tried to keep track of what they're doing, but he hasn't checked with me yet. No, I'm sure he will go back and have a service at some point. But they have not been back yet. They haven't. Yes, ma'am. Sorry.
Will you have an opportunity to go to Washington, do you think? Will he?
I've been told that I'll get to go cover the inauguration. All things are subject to change with the AP. Big news does happen. And being the AP, it could be possible that they could decide that I need to stay in New Orleans or that I need to go to Mumbai. I mean, they are the AP.
But you could move to Washington?
You trying to get rid of me? As I tell people when they ask a question like that, it's above my pay grade.
We have time for one more question. All right, sir.
Is there ever a moment when the candidate is not on, or is there any kind of code you all abide by, unspoken, unwritten? How does that work?
That's a very good question. And there probably are moments, but I was never privy to them. The AP being as big as we are and the reach that we have, we were constricted as to where we could and couldn't go. Best example is in an event like this. Let's say that I'm him talking and y'all in the audience hearing him. The crowd would be set back a little farther. Photographers would be allowed in the front. They might be allowed up there with special permission. You have to get authorization from a staff member and be escorted. Even though the room has been swept by Secret Service, even though you've been swept by Secret Service, and the crowd has been swept by Secret Service. So it's clean is the term that they use. He has real moments. I had a few of those where I made some pictures. He took a call from one of the, I think the head of FEMA, talking about one of the hurricanes this year. and they allowed me to go into the hotel suite and take a picture of him taking the call to discuss the hurricane that was coming to the Gulf Coast. And that was a real moment. He wasn't on because he wasn't paying attention to me. He was busy concentrating. He's a big note taker, so he's taking notes and he's on the phone. And so that sort of thing. A lot of people think that he comes back and on the plane and hangs out with us. Those days are gone. He did not do that kind of thing. He's not in, catching a beer or a glass of wine at the end of the day with the news media. And on the plane, for example, there are all these photographers and all these reporters, and all of them, have been asked by their outlets to, if you get a chance, ask this question today. We're interested in this topic today. And so there's pressure, outside pressure on us that are traveling to get this bit of information that will fit into the larger story of the day. And so he avoids that because that can also take him off message. If what he wants to talk about that day is the economy, and he's got this, or like the great example, he had this meeting with these leaders from different states, these governors and all these other people, and he had this seal in front. You probably saw a picture of that, I don't know if you remember. And it was kind of presidential looking. And the campaign didn't, I don't know if they didn't think it through, they liked it or what the deal was, but all the talk that day was about the seal. Not about what he spoke about, not about this incredible group of people that he put together, that were, significant leaders within their states. It was about this one little tidbit. And so to avoid moments like that, he really didn't come back very much and have much conversation. I mean, there were a few moments. I mean, early on, I wasn't there. They, all the media wrote their name on a dollar bill and put it in a hat and took it up to the front, and whoever's name was drawn out of the pot won the dollar bill, won the lot of all the dollar bills, and he pulled the name out, stuff like that. And on his birthday, he came back and gave everybody a slice of birthday cake, So, and that's right. That's it. My good friend here, Steve, who works for the company that handles the plane that charters the aircraft that we were in, was with us a great many days and nights, and some very early mornings. The last night, for example, I guess it was the last night, he came back and shook everybody's hand and said thank you, which was a pretty nice moment. And most of us didn't record it. I don't know that TV rolled on it, and I don't know that I shot it, because it wasn't about that. It was about him being a normal person.